In the heart of Lagos, amidst the towering skyscrapers and the constant hum of city life, lived a young boy named Chijioke Nwachukwu. At the tender age of 7, his life had been defined by an almost suffocating silence. His deep brown eyes held a sorrow that spoke volumes, a sorrow born from abandonment, from the day his mother Nkeki left him when he was just a baby. Since then, Chijioke had not uttered a single word, and no one had been able to break the barrier of silence that surrounded him. His father, Chief Obinna Nwachukwu, was a man whose reputation stretched across Lagos and beyond. A wealthy businessman with power and influence, Obinna's name was synonymous with success. He had everything any man could want: a sprawling mansion, luxurious cars, a bustling career, but one thing remained absent from his life: the connection with his son. The mansion that should have been filled with laughter, joy, and the sounds of a family was instead suffocating in silence. Obinna's world, despite the grandeur surrounding him, was a lonely one. He would often watch Chijioke from across the room, trying to reach out to him, to connect with him, but the boy's silence made it impossible. His heart ached, as it always had since his wife's departure. But this time it hurt even more, because the silence of his son was a constant reminder of his failure as a father. Chijioke's silence made him feel more alone than ever. Obinna had tried everything. He had taken Chijioke to the best doctors, therapists, and specialists, hoping for a miracle, hoping for a breakthrough. But each attempt ended in the same way: no words, just silence. The doctors had called it selective mutism, a psychological condition where a child refuses to speak due to trauma, but they couldn't explain the depth of the boy's silence. And with every failed attempt, the gap between father and son grew wider. One rainy afternoon, as the sound of raindrops drummed against the windows of the Nwachukwu mansion, a new face appeared at the door: Mika. She was a young woman from a small town, hired by Obinna to help care for Her arrival was met with some skepticism from Obinna, who wasn't sure what she could do that everyone else hadn't already tried. After all, what could a maid, no matter how kind or patient, do to reach a boy who had not spoken in years? But Amika was different from anyone Obinna had ever met. She didn't see Chijioke's silence as something to fix, or something to be ashamed of. She didn't see him as a lost cause. Instead, she saw a child in need of love, patience, and understanding. Amika's heart was full of compassion, and from the moment she entered the mansion, she made it her mission to care for Chijioke, to be there for him in ways others had failed to be. She greeted him with a gentle smile and a soft voice, speaking to him as though he were the most important person in the room. "Hello, Chijioke. I'm Emika. I'm here to take care of you," she said, kneeling down to his level. Chijioke didn't respond, as expected. He simply stared at her, his big brown eyes reflecting the deep sadness that seemed to consume him. But Amika wasn't discouraged. She didn't mind the silence. Instead, she spoke to him every day, gently, encouraging him, showing him affection without expecting anything in return. She didn't try to force him to speak. She didn't rush him. Every morning she would sit with him, offering him a toy, reading a book aloud, or simply being there beside him. She treated him with the same care and attention she would give to her own family. But her love for Chijioke was more than just care. It was a belief in him. She believed that beneath the silence, there was a boy who wanted to communicate, a boy who wanted to be seen and heard. Amika was patient. She understood that healing would take time, but she was ready for that journey. And every day, she saw small glimpses of hope. Sometimes, Chijioke would look at her with a spark of recognition in his eyes. Other times, he would reach out for her hand, a sign that he trusted her. These small gestures were progress, and they were enough to keep Amika going. She wasn't trying to rush him. She simply wanted him to feel safe. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Amika's belief in Chijioke only grew stronger. She could feel that he was starting to connect with her. He would watch her with a quiet intensity, and sometimes, she caught him smiling, ever so slightly. She knew that beneath his silence, there was a world of emotions, a world that only needed a little love to break free. But despite her growing connection with him, there was still a chasm between Chijioke and his father. Chief Obinna watched from a distance, torn between hope and frustration. He could see that Amika had started to make a difference, but the boy still didn't speak to him. The silence lingered, and Obinna's heart ached every time he tried to reach out to his son, only to be met with the same unyielding quiet. But Amika remained patient, never rushing, never forcing, always believing that one day, Chijioke would speak. She knew that the boy needed time, and she was willing to give him all the time in the world. And so, Day after day, Amika continued her work, tending to Shigeoka with love and care. She knew that healing wasn't a quick process, but she believed in the boy's potential, in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Little did she know, this journey would lead to a breakthrough that would change their lives forever. But for now, all they had was the silence that was beginning to show signs of breaking. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, and with each passing moment, Amika found herself growing more attuned to Chijioke's silent world. Her presence had become a steady comfort to him. He still didn't speak, but he began to respond to her in other ways. When Amika placed his favorite toy car in front of him, he would reach out and hold it tightly, his small fingers gripping the wheels with an intensity that spoke of the need for control in a world that had long felt out of his grasp. He would look at her, his gaze often lingering just a little longer than before, as though trying to communicate in a way words couldn't capture. Amika was patient, more patient than anyone had ever been with Shigeoka. She didn't push him, but she encouraged him, giving him space to navigate his emotions without pressure. Each day, she gently spoke to him, offering words of encouragement, never expecting an answer, but always hoping that one day, he would find his voice again. Amika believed in the boy's strength, even when he didn't believe in himself. It was one morning, as Amika sat beside Chijioka in the garden, that she noticed something different. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow across the lush garden. Chijioka sat on the grass, his tiny hands fidgeting with a blade of grass, while Amika spoke softly, as she often did. "Chijioka," she said gently, "I know you can hear me. You are safe here. You don't need to be afraid. I'm here with you." As if in response, Chijioka shifted his body slightly, looking up at her. His eyes, which had always seemed so distant, now held a flicker of something, a connection, a spark of understanding. Amika's heart quickened as she saw that familiar look in his eyes. She had seen it before, but this time, there was something new, something more. Amika reached out, her voice soft but filled with warmth. "You are not alone, Chijioka. You can always talk to me." For a long moment, there was only silence. Amika smiled gently, not discouraged, but encouraged by the progress she saw. Just then, Chijioka's lips trembled. It was so slight that Amika wasn't sure if she had imagined it. But then, she heard it, a whisper, so faint it almost seemed like a breeze. "Mummy." Amika froze. Her heart skipped a beat as the word sank in. It was the first word Chijioka had ever spoken, and it wasn't just any word, it was mummy. The word that had been locked away in his heart for so long. Amika felt the flood of emotions rise up within her. She wasn't sure if it was joy, disbelief, or a deep sense of relief. But she knew one thing: this was a breakthrough. "Chijioka," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Did you just say something?" Chijioka looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. His face was a mixture of confusion and wonder, as though he wasn't entirely sure what had just happened. But Amika saw the flicker of recognition in his gaze. He had done it. He had spoken. Amika's heart swelled with pride. She knew that this moment, this small but monumental step, was the beginning of something much larger than either of them could understand. Without wasting another second, she rushed to find Obina. Her feet seemed to fly across the floor as she hurried through the house, searching for him. She finally found him in his study, a place where he often retreated to escape the weight of the world outside. Amika burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement. "Chief Obina, come quickly," she said, her voice barely able to contain the joy she felt. "You need to hear this. Your son," he spoke. Obina looked up at her, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His mind struggled to process her words. Chijioka spoke. It was a phrase he had never expected to hear, especially after years of silence. His eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Spoke," he repeated, still unsure whether to believe her. "What do you mean?" Amika took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. "I was with him in the garden, and I spoke to him, just as I always do. And then he said it. He said, 'Mummy.'" She paused, waiting for Obina's reaction. It was the first word he's ever spoken. Obina stood up from his desk, the weight of her words slowly sinking in. "Mummy." The word struck him deeply. It wasn't directed at him, but it was still a breakthrough, a sign that his son was beginning to heal, a sign that the silence could be broken. He rushed outside, Amika following closely behind him. When he saw Chijioka sitting on the grass, looking up at him with his quiet gaze, a strange mix of emotions filled his chest. There was awe, wonder, and yes, even a little bit of fear. Could this really be happening? Was it possible that his son, the child who had never spoken, was starting to come back to life. Kichioke, Obina called softly, kneeling down in front of his son. Son, can you speak to me too? For a brief moment, Kichioke just stared at him, his lips slightly parted, as if considering whether to respond. Obina's heart raced. Would his son finally speak to him? But Chijioke simply looked at him with those large, soulful eyes, then returned his gaze to the ground. Mummy, he repeated quietly, almost as if unsure of the meaning of the word himself. Obina's chest tightened, and a lump formed in his throat. His son had spoken, but the word was still for his mother, not him. Yet, it didn't matter. It was the beginning. It was a sign that his son's silence was finally starting to crack. For the first time in years, Obina felt a glimmer of hope. The day would go down as a pivotal moment in their lives. Chi had spoken his first word, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Nowachuku family, a chapter of healing, connection, and, above all, love. The days that followed were filled with a mix of emotions, hope, excitement, and uncertainty. The word mommy that Chijioke had spoken was like a key that unlocked a door. But it was only the first of many steps in his emotional journey. While it was a huge milestone, the silence still lingered between father and son. Chijioke had spoken, yes, but he hadn't spoken to his father. Obina spent hours sitting with his son, trying to bridge the distance that had always been there. He was patient, perhaps more patient than he had ever been before. For years, he had longed for a connection with Chijioke, but now, when that connection seemed possible, it was still elusive. Every time he spoke to Chijioke, the boy would look at him, his deep brown eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and yearning, but he would never speak. Obina, though frustrated, was determined not to give up. He had failed his son in the past, but now, he had a chance to make things right. He knew that the road to healing was going to be long and difficult, but it was a road he was willing to walk, no matter how slow or uncertain it seemed. Emika continued to work with Chijioke every day, helping him to find his voice in the most gentle and loving way possible. She knew that this wasn't just about words, it was about emotional healing, about breaking through the walls that had been built around Chijioke's heart for so long. And she was more determined than ever to help him find that healing. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Obina watched Amika interact with Chi. The boy was sitting beside her on the couch, and Amika was reading aloud from a book. Kichioke was quietly following along, his eyes glued to the page, but he wasn't speaking. Amika, though, seemed completely unbothered. She smiled gently as she continued, reading each word with a calm and soothing tone, as though she were simply keeping the space warm and safe for Chijioke. As Amika read, she occasionally glanced over at Obina, who was sitting across the room. She could see the longing in his eyes, the quiet desperation he felt to connect with his son. But she also saw something else, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. She knew that Obina had a long way to go in rebuilding his relationship with Kichioke, but it was progress. She could see the small signs of healing, the moments where Kichioke's eyes softened, where he seemed to open up just a little bit more. Kichioke, Amika said softly, looking down at him as she reached the end of the page. Do you want to say something? Kichioke turned his head slowly, looking up at her with wide eyes. For a moment, he said nothing, but then, almost in a whisper, he murmured, ... Mummy. Amika smiled gently, her heart soaring with joy. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that moment, she knew that the bond between Kichioke and his mother was still very much alive. Even if it had been lost for so many years, he still had love for her. He still had the words inside him. And with time, he would find his way back to full healing. Obina watched the exchange quietly, his heart swelling with emotion. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something meaningful. The word mummy still hurt, but it also filled him with a sense of hope. He knew that he couldn't rush his son. He had to allow him to take his time, to find his voice when he was ready. But that day, he saw something that he hadn't seen before. Chijioke was opening up. Slowly but surely, he was starting to trust again. The next few days were a blend of small victories. Chijioke began to show more signs of emotional connection. He would reach out to touch Amika's hand, his fingers brushing hers softly, as if seeking reassurance. Sometimes, he would look at Obina for just a moment longer than usual, as though silently acknowledging his presence. It wasn't much, but for Obina, it was everything. It was the first sign that his son was starting to heal, that he was beginning to see him, not as a stranger, but as a father. But Chijioke was still distant from him. He would respond to Emeka's gentle encouragements. But when Obina spoke to him, the boy would often look away or remain silent. Emeka saw this, and she could feel the pain in Obina's eyes. She knew it wasn't easy, but she also knew that this was part of the process. It wasn't just about speaking. It was about building trust, about creating a foundation of love and security before Chijioke could truly open up to his father. One evening, after dinner, Emeka suggested that they play a game together, something light-hearted, something that would bring the family closer. Obina hesitated at first, unsure if Chijioke was ready for that kind of interaction. But Emeka's gentle persistence wore him down. Together, they sat down on the living room floor, a simple board game between them. Chijioke sat quietly at first, but after a few minutes, he reached for the game pieces, his fingers brushing Obina's hand. Obina's heart swelled as he felt the boy's touch. It was the first time that Chijioke had willingly reached out to him without hesitation. It wasn't words, but it was communication. It was a breakthrough in its own way. Emeka watched the two of them, her heart filled with quiet pride. She knew that this was a significant moment, a moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Nwachukwu family. And for the first time in a long time, Obina felt a sense of peace, a sense of connection. His son was still silent, but the walls were coming down. Slowly, but surely, they were starting to rebuild what had been broken. And in that moment, Obina knew that the journey was far from over, but they were on the right path. A path of healing, trust, and love. A path that would lead them to a family no longer defined by silence, but by the deep bond they were slowly, but surely, creating together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of subtle progress and emotional breakthroughs. Chijioke had begun to show more signs of emotional connection, though his path to full healing remained a quiet, slow journey. Every day was a step forward, sometimes imperceptible, but always meaningful. Emeka, ever patient, continued to be the steady presence that Chijioke needed, while Obina worked tirelessly to create a space where his son could feel safe enough to heal and speak. One afternoon, as the sun bathed the Nwachukwu home in its warm light, Obina sat on the patio, a cup of coffee in his hands, lost in thought. The family had just finished lunch, and Emeka was inside with Chijioke, helping him with his homework. It had been a long journey for both father and son, but they were finally beginning to understand each other, even if it was in small ways. Obina had never been one to express his emotions easily. His life, after all, had been defined by the pursuit of success, of achieving greatness in the business world. He had always believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. But Chijioke's silence had forced him to reevaluate everything he knew about connection and family. Now, he understood that true healing didn't come from wealth or status. It came from love. It came from giving someone the space to heal, to be seen, and to be heard. The relationship between father and son had slowly shifted. They didn't need to speak to communicate anymore. The bond that had once felt so distant was starting to feel like something real, something unspoken but profoundly understood. Obina found himself sitting with Chijioke more, talking to him about his day, asking questions, and allowing the boy to respond in whatever way he could. The silence no longer felt like a wall, but a space where trust could grow. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, a moment occurred that would forever change the dynamic between father and son. Obina had just finished telling a funny story about something that had happened at work, and Emeka was laughing along with him. Chijioke, sitting on the floor with his toy cars, looked up at his father, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. Obina said softly, leaning forward. "Do you want to tell me what you think?" For a moment, Chijioke simply stared at him. The room fell silent, but not in the same way it had before. This silence was different. It was filled with possibility. After what seemed like an eternity, Chijioke's small voice broke through the stillness. Daddy Obina's breath caught in his throat. The word was simple, yet it carried with it the weight of years of longing. His heart swelled with a love so deep, so overwhelming, that for a moment, he couldn't speak. He had spoken to him, not as a stranger, not as someone to be feared, but as his father. The silence that had once kept them apart had now become a bridge, a way for them to finally connect. Tears welled in Obina's eyes as he gazed at his son, who was now looking at him with an expression that was a mix of uncertainty and hope. Obina reached out slowly, pulling Chijioke into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Emeka stood in the doorway, watching the father and son embrace. Her heart was full as she saw the transformation in the family. She had always believed in Chijioke, But now she saw the beginning of a new chapter, one that was filled with healing, love, and connection. She had always known that the silence would one day break, but this moment was beyond anything she had imagined. It was a testament to the power of patience, the strength of love, and the quiet resilience that lay within the heart of a young boy who had suffered more than anyone could understand. In the days that followed, the bond between father and son continued to grow stronger. Kichioke began speaking more, not just to Amika, but to Obina as well. It was still a slow process, but each word, each gesture of connection, felt like a victory. And with every passing day, the silence that had once defined their lives became less and less of a barrier. Instead, it became a part of their shared history, a reminder of how far they had come together. One afternoon, Obina sat down with Amika in the garden, the two of them enjoying the peaceful moment together. Chijioke was inside, playing quietly, his soft laughter echoing from the open window. Obina looked over at Amika, a grateful smile on his face. "I don't think I ever really understood what it meant to be a father," he said quietly. "I was so focused on providing, on being successful, but I missed the most important part of the connection. I missed being present for my son. But with you, Amika, I feel like I've found a way to be the father Chijioke needs." Amika smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "Healing takes time, Chief. You've come a long way, and you're not alone in this journey. You and Kichioke have each other now, and that's all that matters." Obina nodded, the weight of her words settling in. He had always thought that being a father meant providing for his son, in the traditional sense, money, security, success. But now he realized that being a father meant being there, truly being present. It meant showing love, patience, and understanding, even in the face of silence. As the weeks passed, the Noachiku family grew stronger, more connected. The mansion that had once been filled with a lonely, oppressive silence was now a place of warmth, laughter, and shared moments. And though Chijioke still had his struggles, there was no doubt that his journey to healing was well underway. In the end, the family didn't need perfect words or grand gestures. They just needed each other. With love, time, and patience, they had built a home where silence no longer ruled, but where love was the loudest and most powerful force of all.